This is a gear reduction position change video for the General Pump model MW. The tools and supplies needed for this repair are an impact wrench, an 8mm hex, 3 4-inch 8mm threaded jacking bolts, a 17mm socket, a 13mm socket, a gear puller tool, an M12 threaded bolt, 2 10mm jacking screws, a slide hammer, protective gloves, a 10mm hex, a hard rubber hammer, 2 10mm positioning pins, a torque wrench, a scraper blade, a cleaning rag, and adhesive remover. Use an impact wrench with an 8mm hex to remove the 7 outer case cover retaining bolts. Thread the 3 4-inch 13mm jacking bolts. Use an impact wrench with a 13mm socket, making sure to evenly lift the outer case cover. Remove the outer case cover. Use a torque wrench with a 17mm socket to remove the 2 ring gear stopper bolts. Remove the ring gear stopper. Use a gear puller to remove the ring gear from the crankshaft. Use an impact wrench with an 8mm hex to remove the 8 inner cover retaining bolts. Thread 3 4-inch 8mm jacking bolts. Use a ratchet with a 13mm socket and evenly insert the 3 bolts, making sure to evenly lift the inner case cover. Remove the inner case cover. Use a scraper blade to remove the old gasket from the crankcase mating surface. Be sure to scrape any and all residual material. Use a rag with adhesive remover to clean the mating surface of the crankcase. Use a scraper blade to remove the old gasket from the inner cover mating surface. Be sure to scrape any and all residual material. Use a rag with adhesive remover to clean the mating surface of the crankcase. Thread 2 10mm positioning pins into the crankcase. Install a new gasket onto the crankcase. Install the inner cover into proper position. Thread 2 10mm jacking screws into the inner cover on opposite sides of the crankshaft. Use a ratchet with a 17mm socket and alternate between the 2 bolts to evenly lower the inner cover into place. Thread 2 10mm bolts on opposite sides of the crankshaft and alternate tightening each. Tightening the bolts will lower and fit the inner cover into place. Use a ratchet and remove the jacking bolts. Remove the 2 positioning pins. Thread the remaining 8mm bolts into place and tighten using a ratchet with an 8mm hex. Use a torque wrench to tighten to the proper specs. Due to the very sharp edges, use protective gloves to install the ring gear onto the crankshaft. Use a hard rubber hammer to lightly tap the ring gear into place. Place the ring gear cover into place and thread the 2 bolts. Use a ratchet with a 17mm socket to tighten the bolts. Use a torque wrench to tighten to the proper specs. Seat an O-ring into the groove around the inner cover. Thread 2 10mm positioning pins into the inner cover. Install the outer cover with the pinion. Rotate the pinion to help properly seat the outer cover and pinion into place. Thread 5 of the 7 outer cover mounting bolts. Use a ratchet with an 8mm hex to tighten the bolts. Remove the 2 positioning pins. Thread the remaining 2 outer cover mounting bolts. Use a ratchet with an 8mm hex to tighten the bolts. Use a torque wrench with a 10mm hex and tighten to the proper specs.